We've had a look at the technology, so we thought we should just tell you a little bit about it. Firstly, the history of freeze drying. It's been around for many, many decades. Basically, it started in the pharmaceutical and medical industry and also in the food industry. And you're probably all familiar with freeze-dried coffee or freeze-dried fruits and things that we buy in the supermarkets. It's the same technology. It wasn't really until the late 80s that we realised that it had a potential to help us in the restoration industry as well. Because we're dealing with the same thing. We need to get moisture out of a product without damaging that product, which is the same in the food or the medical industry. So we use the process of sublimation. You may or may not have heard of vacuum freeze drying, but that is the machine that you've seen out there. That is the largest vacuum freeze dryer in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's what we use to process our goods, using the science of sublimation. Sublimation, in layman's terms, is basically taking water in a solid state, or ice, and taking it to a gas state, or humidity, if you like, in the air, but bypassing the liquid phase again. So again, if I can summarise that, we've got ice in the chamber and we're taking it to gas outside the chamber without it getting wet again. And that's crucial to the restoration process. Paperwork, your X-ray films, your media, whatever it is only getting damaged by water while water's in the liquid phase. So the secret to us is to minimise the exposure to that liquid phase. And we start the process very simply, and so can you. All we need to do is freeze the product. You can do that at your local abattoir, you may have a friendly restaurateur, or you can hire a freeze reefer or something like that. But basically, as quickly as possible, if you freeze the item of concern, you've stopped the damage. Because again, I'll emphasise, it's only in the liquid phase that we're going to have damage to these products. That's where we come in. Steamatic comes in then at your call, and we'll manage to dry those goods without them ever getting wet again, using sublimation. So why would you use freeze drying to dry your documents or your records? There are alternatives, certainly. You can leave it to Mother Nature. But I can assure you, you've probably all seen it even with your newspapers that have got wet. They tend to fuse together, the paper sticks together, and you try and retrieve it and use that information and you lose the data because as you pull the pages apart, the image vanishes or it rips. Our process stops this. It also stops the cockling of the paper. You'll see papers and records when they get wet. The fibres take up the moisture. And because it's got a certain shape, that file, it's under pressure with this moisture and it starts to get out of shape and crockle or crinkle, if you like. As soon as you've frozen your documents, that process is stopped as well. In other words, how you give it to us frozen is how you're going to get it back, its appearance. So why do you use it? You don't want this damage to your documents. There are other alternative processes. You can use a dehumidification process, which was what was used before we started pioneering the freeze drying of records. Dehumidification works. It's slow, it's expensive, and it has some other issues. You've still got microbial and bacterial growth while these documents are wet. In a frozen state, you don't. That's why we use a freezer in the home. We want to keep our home, our food fresh. So you bought this time. Dehumidification is an alternative if you have a very small quantity. If you like, if you've got a very small quantity, use your hairdryer and do it yourself page by page. But most of us in the corporate world or in a larger loss don't have the time or the desire to take that approach. Dehumidification, as I mentioned, is very slow. So because it's slow, the document is still wet and in that liquid phase, it's still deteriorating, or as we call it, it's still at loss. Our process eliminates this. You freeze it, you can keep it as long as you like. In fact, I'm aware of one institution that still has documents in frozen state from 12 years ago, while they make a decision, is it desirable or needed to restore these goods? So who can use this? You can use this service as a homeowner. You have a small loss, maybe it's your wedding album that got wet. Run it down to your friend's house. If you've lost power because you've had a storm or whatever, run it down to your friend's house, put it in the deep freezer, and you've saved your photo album. You've saved those memories, which to us is priceless. Of course, in a major loss, you're not going to be able to do that. You have to go to the abattoirs, you have to find your friendly restaurateur, or call Steamatic. We'll be able to arrange for our network of freezers to have those documents frozen for you, which buys you time, which is the critical component. We're not advocating that everything should be freeze-dried. If it's able to be reproduced, you have another copy, why do it? But if you've frozen it, you've bought the time for rational decisions to be made, and then we can give you advice and expertise to help you through that process. So who uses this? Yes, the homeowner can use it. We've done jobs for all sorts of institutions, medical institutions, x-rays, whatever's got wet, we can freeze it. And with the new vacuum freeze dry chamber that we've got here, with 120 cubic metres of vacuum space, we could really dry anything. We joke we could even dry Phar Lap if it got wet, and we hope we do one day. But it's important to understand, get it frozen, then call us, we'll be able to help you. So we've talked about who could use it, and the applications are endless. And I guess we've talked predominantly about restoration, but this process is used in many other applications, as I indicated, with the food and pharmaceuticals. We've done many peculiar cases. We've dried sea sample beds from the Bass Strait, so that we, again, taking a product out and drying it without damaging its integrity allows scientists to have a look at it and analyse that seabed in a laboratory environment. We've done recovery of artefacts. We had an Aboriginal canoe pulled out of a creek up in Northern Territory, I think it was, that had been underwater for several hundred years. And the conservators were concerned about how we could assist in saving this integrity of the canoe. Vacuum freeze drying was the answer there as well. We've done, the heritage works are endless with this process because again, we're trying to protect the original state of the product. So we have done obscure items like prisoners' shoes from Pentridge that have been dug up in the excavations, or as mentioned, the canoe in Northern Territory. And we've had some very nice manuscripts that have been sent by private collectors that maybe aren't even known of, that they exist, but these private collectors, when they have a damage, have sought out our services to save them. We're often asked how expensive this process is, and I think memories are priceless, and we can cite many examples where price would not be an indicator or a concern. We have saved, as we've talked about, wedding albums for people, and a wedding album might cost you $20. To me, that's not an expensive process. We've also saved some of Australia's heritage items, from maps from the 1770s that have been flooded right through to this day. Or even your will and testament or something that is important to you and your estate, but in a disaster, it may be gone. The records where you think it's backed up may be gone. So be prepared and think about this prior to a loss. The important part of recovery is having a O attitude, emergency attitude. Yes, we can still restore these documents maybe after a 7 or 10 day period of being wet. But remember what I said, it's how you give it to us and we freeze it is how you get it back. If you give it to us after 1 day of being wet, there isn't much damage. You're going to get back a very good product. You give it to us after 10 days and it's going to be compromised in that 10 days. We'll still restore it, but aesthetically it won't be the same. To give you an indication of costs, because it's always important to make the judgment whether you proceed or not. A typical archive box similar to this would be processed for under $100. If it's important to you, it's cheap. I can cite you an example where we did a claim where we did many hundreds or thousands of these, and we saved that client in excess of $23 million of recovery. And what do I mean by recovery? I mean, had they lost the information contained in those records, they had to reproduce them. So it's important not only for the physical asset to be restored, but in the corporate world, what is the business interruption if that information is missing? And how do you value that to your business? It's a well-known fact in the industry that something like 60 to 70% of businesses that suffer a major disaster fail within the following 5 years. Don't let that happen to you, and it's usually the information that's missing. We can rebuild buildings, we can put desks back in buildings, we can get people back into business. But if you've lost your information, that's priceless.